The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. This is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss, welcoming you to the last lecture of the first movement of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. Of course, this won't be the last lecture in the series because the series will go on through all the remaining four movements. This movement is really rushing to a finish, and it's quite exciting to be going over the different passages with you along the way. So let's take a look at rehearsal mark N1, tempo primo più animato, so a little faster. So this is that same tiptoeing passage that we studied at the end of the last lecture. Pretty much note for note in the instruments that are carried over from there, but there are some instruments added. And the passage goes on for a couple of extra bars before heading towards a resolution. So, just really briefly, let's not spend too much time on this. Unison A4 bassoons. So all four bassoons this time playing the staccato in octaves with the double basses, playing pizzicato. And once again, measured tremolo in the strings, and the upper winds just kind of reacting, playing the same pitches as the basses and bassoons, only in octaves above. So what is different? Well, aside from the extra two bars at the end, we've got the petite flute, the piccolo, doubling the same pitch as the first violins. And that's just slowly, steadily rising. And you can hear it if you really listen. And what's interesting about that is with that character of flute on that pitch, you almost feel like a bounce going on here with some of the pitches that are the same. So C sharp, bouncing down to C sharp an octave lower and coming back. Then same thing with D. We have the little echo of a D here. And then here it sort of breaks apart for a bit. And then we come back with E and so on. F sharp right in here. So some of these pitches have a bit of a slap back when the piccolo is added on. The other thing that's different is the timpani coming in here and hitting certain pitches. So obviously it hits at the same time as a G, right? Because that makes sense. So it's the same exact pitch as this pizzicato G in the basses. Now here it hits a G as well, and that's kind of interesting because essentially that would be the fifth of a diminished chord, C sharp, E, and G. So that also counts. That is possibly something new to Berlioz. And then here we've got another G as well in the double basses that's being doubled. Then here we have something similar to before. We have an E diminished chord, E, G, and B flat. So this time the timpani is hitting the third of that diminished chord. Now here we've got a C, and that is essentially playing the third of an A minor chord. Now here on this G, we've got a G6-3 chord, so this is still the root, and it's coming in under this B, but it's still heard as a B by the ear, going at that speed blended into the staccato and pizzicato around it. And then we've got the same C right in here. And then, of course, rounding off with cornets coming in to lead to the resolution on the next page. So I just thought all that was worth pointing out, and especially how the timpani doesn't necessarily have to play the root all the time. It can play adjacent pitches that are part of the harmony, most often like the fifth or the third in a minor or diminished chord. Those are ways that you can get away with adding more timpani in a situation like this where a quick change is not possible, say with a turn of the crank or with changing the pedal. Both of those things really would have been somewhat unavailable to Berlioz, or maybe undependable in terms of changing the tuning crank on the fly. Maybe he couldn't trust the players, if you know what I mean. So let's take a look at the next page, now that we've refreshed whatever is the same and different about this screen as opposed to the one that we saw in the last lecture. And we see once again a resolution to the 5, but this time it is from a C 6/4 chord, right? So we've got the G in the bass, and then of course C and E above, and just kind of spread out across the orchestra. And I'm not going to go into a laborious breakdown of what the harmony is, but this would make a good study of a tutti chord. It's very well constructed with the flute and the oboe and first oboe doubling the second violins, and then we've got this beautiful ringing G way up high and the piccolo up above that on the high C, and so on. It's just really beautifully well constructed. And notice that everything is quite high. The basses are very high, right? And so are the cellos. And so are the bassoons. The one thing that is really worth pointing out here is that when the context of the chord changes, we get the B right in here rather than the G fifth as we did before. So here Berlioz is risking that major third right in there, which would be a note that had to be corrected through lip pressure or through changing pitches with the hand. But he's not trusting the trumpets still. And of course, we've got that same B right in here at pitch with the horns. This is the same exact note, right? Because down a fourth, we get the B below the staff, and then that's the same as this transposing down an octave. Now we are heading into some completely new territory. And syncopations really fascinated the late classical, early romantic composers. From Mozart to Haydn's last works, but especially Beethoven. And of course, Beethoven was a huge education for Berlioz in terms of kind of magnifying and exaggerating certain emotional and motivic qualities of the music. Syncopation, of course, being one of the major ones of Beethoven, we can really see that that lesson has been learned. There are some really cool ideas right here in the strings. Some very simple double stops. Here, this looks insane, okay? This A 2 octaves apart, but it's actually really easy to play. You just have to make sure that this high A and your open A string, which is the second string, are both in tune with each other. And if your A string has sort of gone out of tune slightly, then it's not the funnest thing, but if you're playing in a section, it's not a big deal. So you can see that sometimes the violins perform a melodic role, trading off between the two groups. It's just a very playful thing, with the rest of the strings basically being more kind of rhythmic and harmonic elements. And the entire time, all of the upper winds are basically playing the melodic idea. Of course, the brass are just so powerful here, just so strong, just bellowing out, barking out that rhythm, that it's at times hard to hear the melodic portion of this. Is that really a melody? It's just really more kind of arpeggiation. Notice that no matter how much we have these little departures away from 1s and 5s with E flats and A flats and so on, F sharp, entering the harmony, there is still some real basic 1s and 5s in the timpani and in some of the natural brass. We've got the 1s on the C, we got the 5s here and the D and so on. So whatever Berlioz may be doing with the harmony in here, it agrees with some of the natural pitches. And that is the limitation, isn't it, of this era. Even with a composer as exploratory, as groundbreaking as Berlioz, there's still the realization that not every pitch is available from the horns and the trumpets. And it led to some very clever calculations. But that got to its kind of height under Wagner, who still used natural horns to a degree, and Brahms. Interesting, those were sort of the polar opposites, and there were people in different camps, the Brahms camp and the Wagner camp. Not that the two composers were directly in competition with one another personally, but there were different supporters and cliques and critics and so on, all discussing who was the better composer, what was the better approach for the future. And then, of course, the late Romantics came along and just merged everything together. That sort of discipline of Brahms and the very thoughtful nature, along with the big splashy orchestration and so on. So you see that in Bruckner and Mahler and so on, Strauss. But that's way ahead. That's lifetimes ahead of where we are in this piece. Just getting back to the topic here, you can see why the cornets are brought in. So cornets with pistons being much more available to Berlioz than trumpets with pistons. So very important for the cornets to come in there and to play some of the pitches that are not available to the brass, and just to end up with whatever harmony he can get, whatever intriguing motions away from standard 1s and 5s. Just like before, he ends his Tutti right here, not on the tonic. He's really holding back the tonic. So he has this beautiful bustling passage in the strings. And notice how it's set up. We have a scale starting on G going up to D, and then the seconds and violas coming in, starting on a B in unison together, and then back to the violins and cellos, starting on a D. So it's sort of like stepping on each other's toes down a third and so on. And then getting to here, we have that sort of down a second, up a third kind of idea, going all the way up here to this D octave. Once again, not resolving. Berlioz is really going to hold off on going to a C chord until the end of the page, right? Or at the end of the screen in our case. And I just think that's so fun. And then here we've got the bassoons, I guess all four bassoons playing unison in octaves with the double basses. And what's interesting about that is that this covers some of the same pitches as the cellos, or will be harmonizing with them, right? So the G is the same pitch, but then right in here, the motion is going up in thirds, right? And then with this D, it's the same pitch, but then here, it's harmonizing from below in thirds, and so on. And this is just a little bit of extra support for the double basses. And then here, coming back in, we have the contrary motion of cellos and double basses harmonize, right? These are thirds, not octaves, right? So we've got the A on top and the F right underneath it, leading down to this G major chord. And notice how the double basses are playing the third right in the middle. See, a lot of this stuff just really seems to me to be things that are unique to Berlioz, just little touches like that. Now, who else would put the double basses on the harmonic third and the cellos on the fifth? And you can sort of see the construction from there. This is a very, very easy triple stop to play for the violas. Those are two natural pitches, the G and the D, and then all I have to do is add the sixth up here in this B. And then D octaves, very, very simple, with the way that the hand is positioned right here on this unison figuration going upwards. So what is going on with our clarinets and bassoons is something very similar, right? We have the bassoons going downwards, basically the second bassoon, second and fourth, I guess, if this is all four bassoons, playing the same exact pitches as the double bass, right? So this is actually enclosing the cellos, the octaves in the bassoons, but that's not all. These octaves right here are actually playing the same pitch here as the top line of this octave in the bassoons. We end on this big G, and we've got a little punch here in the brass as well. Pretty simple scoring. And then backing off here, just some pizzicato, very simple little pitches from the strings, very soft playing from the winds. And we finally approach a C major chord, but we don't get the big sense of resolution yet. And then finally we get this big crashing end, and this is very, very similar, very reminiscent to the way that Berlioz wrapped up the sort of yearning section at the very beginning. His almost embarrassing admission that a lot of his passions have been going on since he was like 11 years old or something. A lot of his compulsions, his compulsive tendency to form these attractions has been going on. So there's something similar to this wrapped up that section. So it's almost like bookends, right? We have that big kind of crashing C major chord at the beginning when the sonata allegro starts, and this seems to be the end, right? So here's the end of the sonata allegro, and all that remains is the coda coming after that. So in a sense, I mean, it's really a beautiful statement of form right in there. I really respect that, and I think that Berlioz absolutely could have scored in a way that was more clinical form and done it ingeniously. But that's not his motivation as a composer. He wants to make the emotional point. So that is what all of this orchestration is in service to, as well as his sense of form. Going from this E minor, and then right in here to G, and then ending on a C. This is also fairly simple in terms of triple stops. The stacked sixths, that's very easy to do on violin. And here you've got G fourth. This E could be played as a natural note. So you just have to form G and C on the second and third strings. And then right in here, the same thing basically goes for the viola. This G right here as an open string. And then you just play the sixth on top of that, and so on. So pretty simple triple stops. And once again, keeping the basses up. That's something that Berlioz really does in this first movement. Okay, let's have a listen to that. All right, so just listen to the way this wraps up. It just really is very, very cool. And the internal stuff in there, the contrary motion, the way the bassoons are doubling the double basses at an octave, the way that this just really kind of headlong rushes one pitch going over the other pitch until it really reaches this peak right in here. Listen to how Berlioz very cleverly withholds the resolution of C major from all of his little tutti sidetracks right in here. Right, like going to G, ending on a G here for this little section, and then just pizzicato, seeming to resolve, and then coming in and confirming it with this big crashing C chord right at the end. That's very, very clever. And just the way that this appears to be heading towards some kind of major chord resolution, which it sort of does for just like half a beat, right, in cut time. And then just immediately starts to transgress the whole idea of ending on a simple 1 and 5. That's really lovely. And of course, just this great couple of tutti chords right in here. Then before that, see if you can remember what we covered in our previous lecture about the sort of tiptoeing section with the reactions from the upper winds and the measured tremolo on the strings. And of course, once again, saying measured tremolo, it is measured tremolo, and the players are at least attempting to play yaga daga yaga daga, really playing those repeated notes in time. But if the conductor is just really pushing this, it can almost just feel like regular unmeasured tremolo, where the player is just sort of trembling their bow up and down, right? And it'll just sound like that with the very fast tempo approach to this ending section. Listen for the piccolo above, listen for the timpani sort of outlining some of the pitches from below, and how the timpani will merge into the perceived pitch around it, like the bassoons playing C sharps and the timpani playing G but sounding like it's a C sharp just because of the harmony. So listen for all of those things, and I will see you on the last two screens for the beautiful coda, where he brings the listener back down to a wonderful calm ending. And now for the very poignant coda. Once again, we've got the oboe sort of guiding the motion of the music. To some extent, the oboe sort of represents Berlioz. It represents the perspective of the composer, of the young man of Berlioz's notes, who has become overwhelmed by the beauty of the artist. So it's a very simple descending chromatic line, quite poignant, quite beautiful, very elegant. We've got the violins going ba-da-do-dee, ba-da-do-dee, and so on. So here, this massively long slur covering 8 bars for the violas and 9 bars, 8.5 bars for the first violins. This will be divided probably into groups of 2, maybe kind of following the modulation as the oboe descends. So you should watch some live recordings or some live performances if you're really interested in how this might work. So, for instance, I'm looking at a Radio France performance of this, and they just simply broke it up into 3 bars and then 2 and 2. And I think that works pretty well. It's just much more under control for the player. Then things sort of die away, a little bit of pizzicato right here at the end. Once again, keeping the basses up, right? The double basses are doubling the bottom pitch here of the cellos. And then the second violins are playing the upper part of the G major chord, right? B and D, as opposed to G and B. And that, of course, is enclosed by what's going on in the violins and violas. And then just ending on this staccato right in here. So we finally end. I feel like this is some of the resolution we've really been waiting for, right? So it's the beginning of the last statement of the Idée fixe, right? It's becoming more and more reverent. The music is leaving the composer with this wonderful reverie. Maybe he has gone through this huge cycle of obsession and perturbation, and his emotions have really been torn apart by the realization that he is in love with this object of desire, right? Which may or may not really be any anybody he'd really want to spend any time with, as Berlioz himself was to find out eventually that it actually wasn't. He's so carried away, and yet he is left with this feeling of wonderful calm, right? And that's where he wants to leave the audience too, right? Once again, double basses doubling the bottom note of the cellos, and this is one of those perfect horn four-part harmonies, right? So the fifth in the bass, and then up a sixth from the fifth, we've got the mediant, in this case E, and then up a sixth from that, we've got the tonic, right? So that's one of the textbook four-part harmony kinds of voicings. And above that, ba-da-da-ba-ba-ba. Very, very much alone. The aloneness of the music really comes through. The solitude with very simple scoring. And these pitches here are doubled very softly by the oboes. In an ideal situation, the oboes would double almost imperceptibly, but the honest truth is that if the strings are really backing off, then the oboes will tend to stand out. And now, religiosamente, right, in a religious way. And what's funny about this is that, true to this marking, we are ending with plagal cadences. If you don't know what a plagal cadence is, that is a resolution from the 4 chord to the 1 chord, rather than the 5 chord to the 1 chord, which would be a perfect cadence. So it really is ending religiously. There was a certain religious character, religious tendencies of Berlioz, and he did write masses and other religious works, and he was a firm believer, despite his rather kind of wild side, his obsessive side. He did really have a lot of religious fervor as part of his obsessions, I suppose. And we're really seeing that reverence. I feel that this is not ironic at all. It is maybe in his eyes, maybe the gift to feel that compulsion is a spiritual one, right? So I respect that, right? I don't want to mock it. I think that is, that is an honest impulse. Now, there was a little bit of talk in the group recently about how maybe it might be problematic in certain situations because of the overtones of the clarinet to give it a major third, right? So here we're seeing that is really not an issue, especially with string doubling on the same pitches, right? So we've got this A, that is the third of an F chord, right? And that is being doubled by the first clarinet right in here. So it's just, I think you can go a little too far with some of this. And then the lower pitch, this sounding A, written B, is being doubled by the third horn. But what a beautiful pitch to play right in here for the fourth horn. Perilous in some respects, but for a good player, they are just basically holding down this low C, and everybody is sort of playing around it, and they're very reverent, soft tutti right here at the end. So just to analyze it, it is a little strange in terms of what we might consider like more customary kinds of orchestration for that time. Bassoons playing Fs and Es, right, in octaves, doubled by the cellos and basses, right, and then resolving to C, then going back and forth between F and C a couple of times. Here we've got F minor, right? And then this goes to not a regular standard C chord, but a 6/3 chord, right, with a mediant on the bass. right? And that, I think that's just a very, very cool transition. Again, once again, a very original idea. And going a little low here on the oboes for the day, but still just really, really beautiful if the players can control it. And the flutes are doubling the oboes above. And at a very, very soft dynamic, it is a beautiful sound, right? But only if everybody is really playing soft. So the piccolo right here should be swallowed by the resonance of the strings, and especially when doubled by the winds. This high note on the piccolo should be essentially inaudible, but giving the texture just a beautiful radiance. I also love just these little touches on timpani, right? Kind of substituting for pizzicato bass. This is an extremely simple double stop to play. So it's just basically playing up a sixth on the third string, and then the fourth string is open. Right? And then these fifths here in the violas are playing on either side of this E, right? So it's forming a perfect little major chord right in there. Here, we've got the octave Gs, once again, a very simple double stop to play, and then these C thirds also, as well. And this low G is doubling the top note of the violas, and then the octaves are enclosing the thirds. So it's a really beautiful way of voicing this chord across the strings. Now, looking at these C's right at the end, it may be a little confusing throwing in this bass clef. So you just sort of have to think, what did that mean back in the day? It was new notation. So you're sort of thinking up rather than down, right? So, but since we already have the octave transposition, that cancels it out, right? So this essentially is at pitch, right? So you're having your fourth horn play an actual C below the staff, and your third horn playing the C inside the bass staff. So essentially this is just really doubling what's going on with the basses and the cellos on that bottom C, and the violas on the upper C, and that is in turn being doubled by the bassoons. As to everybody else, we've got the E thirds, right? That's covering notes in the first and seconds, and the G on top, and so on with a flute. And then, of course, this is just a G sixth right in here. Same thing, covering pitches by the first and seconds. So it's just a really beautiful, calm chord there at the end. As to your E flat horns, just remember your transposition of down a major sixth, right? So down a major sixth, you get the G and the C. So basically all the horns together are playing C, up an octave to C, and then G and C, right? So that's a middle C right here, this written A. Wonderfully calm, beautiful writing. I mean, this is just orchestration on a different level from what concert music listeners would have been used to. And I want to make the distinction there between concert versus opera, right? So if you went to a concert of instrumental music, you probably wouldn't hear some orchestration on this level. If you went to an opera, you would hear things like this in operas by Weber and so on. But you wouldn't hear anything of this sort of lucidity and intensity, forcing the listener into mental imagery rather than sort of seeing something acted out on stage. That's the power of the imagination that was being used here by Berlioz. One thing I want to sort of point out here is that there are a lot of A's here, right? And that is not a note in the regular harmonic spectrum. And you know, once again, I've consulted with horn players who have played natural horn and so on. And the horns of that day had like little holes on them that helped to adjust tuning and sometimes adjust things up or down a half step or a whole step. So that might have been possible, say, playing a G and then just opening opening a hole and then having it sound up a whole step, right? So in that way you could get those notes, but maybe they weren't the most dependable things, which is why Berlioz kind of avoids them a lot of the time. But it really is showing the pressure that is leading towards the chromatic horn, isn't it? So, even as early as 1830, and the chromatic horn was still a whole lifetime away, or a whole generation away, the fully chromatic horn. And funny thing is, like, both Brahms and Wagner sort of had access to instruments like that, but they still chose to score for natural horn to a large degree. All right, so there is your final tutti. So thinking of tuttis do not have to be loud, do they? They can be extremely soft and sensitive. They don't have to be tissue-like if they are sensitive. Vaporous, right? I write a lot of vaporous tuttis in my music. I'm fascinated by the whole sense of suggestion rather than implication in my tutti scoring when I'm writing things that involve most of the orchestra or all of the orchestra. And yet here we have just very, very calm, beautiful scoring using pretty much everybody who's involved in the movement. There are no cornets here and no trumpets, but other than that, we're pretty much using everybody. And I think it's just really beautiful writing right in here. So listen for all of those things. Listen for that wonderful, calm cohesion right here at the end, and see if you can sort of pick out the different colors that are contributing to the sound. And the same thing right in here. Observe as you go the sort of interacting octaves here in the lower winds and the wonderful structure here of the horns and the beautiful wash of color from the very soft strings. And then, of course, leading into there, listen for the smoothness of the violins, but also being aware that they're really not going to bow 8 bars in a row, even at cut time. That's really a phrase mark, and he's leaving it up to the concertmaster and the section principals to mark where the actual divisions will be in the bowings, which, it's something that we kind of not necessarily frown on today, but you are leaving it up to the players, and every section principal is going to have a different idea on how to do it. And if you're comfortable with that, then great, bully for you, but it's just more work for the player, right? But then again, doing it wrong is also more work for the player. I think I would divide it like this. I would just go 3 bars, and then 2 and 2, and then 2 for the first violins going on. But just really making sure that both groups agreed, the firsts and the violas. So listen for all of those things, and just in conclusion of this movement being the start of our lectures, and I've just really enjoyed bringing it to you. I hope you're getting a lot out of it. I'm really looking forward to discussing the harp of Berlioz's day in the next lecture, which is very rare for a symphony to have, or even just a movement of a symphony to have harp in it. It was really more of an operatic instrument, apparently in ballroom dances as well. I'm really looking forward to that. Thanks everybody so much on Patreon for your support. Thanks to everybody in the community who is watching these videos and these lecture series and letting me know how it is helping them. I've had comments from conductors who appreciated breaking down certain sections and maybe helping them figure out how they were going to conduct or interpret something or get some perspective on it. So thank you to you all for your very kind comments and your support. I really appreciate it. It makes a whole lot of difference. And I've got more great pieces planned for the next couple of years. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you with the second movement very soon.